Romanes is arguing that consciousness and other aspects of human intelligence are not unique to humans. You can see it in other animals as well. The next figure here is a guy named C. Lloyd Morgan, who was a student of Romanes's. Very interesting guy who reacted to reacted to Romanes's imputation of consciousness to lower animals by saying, look, that's a very nice story, it's very romantic, it's wonderful to think about ants having fellow feeling and all of that, but you really shouldn't jump to such conclusions if you can explain their behavior in terms of some lower kind of process. And he argued that the kind of evidence that Romanes accounted for didn't require postulation of anything like consciousness or fellow feeling or emotion or anything like that. All of these behaviors could be accounted for by instincts or trial and error learning. And in fact, Morgan gave us what's known as Lloyd Morgan's canon, which had a profound influence on behaviorists like Watson and Skinner, arguing that you should never attribute to consciousness or intelligence anything that can be explained in terms of some lower order process like instinct or trial and error learning. The upshot of Morgan's work was to deny that there was consciousness in lower humans. But as you'll see in a second, it also turned out that the implication of Morgan's work was to deny consciousness to humans as well. That's what John B. Watson did, basically, was to argue that consciousness and intelligence played no role in animal behavior, but also, by virtue of this Darwinian principle of evolutionary continuity, Watson had to argue that consciousness and intelligence didn't play any role in human behavior either, that all behavior was based on reflex and instinct and conditioned response. So there you have it. You have what I like to think of as the Darwinian paradox of continuity, which is to say that everybody agrees that there's evolutionary continuity between humans and other species, chimpanzees, dogs, cats, fish, and so forth. Romanes was willing to take human traits like consciousness and extend them down, if you will, the evolutionary ladder to so-called lower animals. But Thorndike and Watson read something different in this the postulation of continuity. What they wanted to do was to extend reflexes and instincts and conditioned responses up from lower animals to humans as well. So again, this Darwinian continuity cuts both ways. Either you can use evolutionary continuity as a reason for looking for consciousness in lower animals, so-called lower animals, or you can use Darwinian evolutionary continuity to argue that whatever it is humans think they have as far as consciousness, we don't really have it at all. Okay. Next figure here is an early woman psychologist, first woman to earn a PhD in psychology, Margaret Floy Washburn, who was a student of Morgan's and Romanes's, and actually took up the problem of animal minds and animal consciousness as the theme of her life's work. And she argued that the problem of animal consciousness was really no different from the problem of from the philosophical problem of other minds. How do we know we're conscious as individuals? How do we know somebody else is conscious? Well, we know from their words and we know from their other behaviors. And she says the problem of consciousness in dogs and cats and chimpanzees or whatever is no different from that. That what we have to do is simply make inferences from the behavior of these animals about whether they have consciousness or not. So again, Washburn is willing to draw an analogy between the human mind and the non-human mind. All psychic, that is, all psychological interpretation of animal behavior must be on the analogy of human experience. And she says, if we're willing to attribute consciousness to other people by virtue of their behavior, what's wrong with attributing consciousness to dogs and cats and chimpanzees based on their behavior? And she argued there just wasn't any difference there. So then Washburn goes on to talk about the various kinds of criteria that we might have for attributing mind, by which she means consciousness, to animals. And she says, well, look, there are some that just don't work. The first is you can't say that an animal's conscious just because it responds to stimulation, because, well, you could do that by virtue of reflex, okay? And you can't even attribute mind to an animal based on the fact that it engages in approach avoidance behavior. Again, that could just be a matter of conditioning. Similarly, if an animal adapts its behavior in order to get to a goal, that could just be some form of conditioning. And even variability in behavior doesn't tell you for sure that an animal has a mind or consciousness. And so, having kind of rejected the usual kinds of criteria for attributing a mind to animals, she says, look, there are two things that you really got to have if you're going to attribute mind to behavior. The first is an anatomical resemblance to humans, by which she doesn't mean 2 arms and 2 legs and all of that. What she really means is brain anatomy. The more an animal's brain looks like a human brain, the more justification we have for thinking that that animal might have some kind of consciousness the way we do. And the second criterion, which is more of a behavioral criterion, she argued, was rapid learning on the basis of an animal, something that couldn't be accounted for by mere trial and error learning of the Pavlovian or Thorndikean type classical conditioning or instrumental conditioning. And in fact, there are reasons for thinking, some historians of psychology have argued, that Watson's, the immediate target for Watson's treatise on behaviorism was not Thorndike, which is what for a long time we thought, but was actually Washburn and her willingness to set out criteria for attributing mind and consciousness to animals. Okay, so what kinds of behaviors have served as criteria for consciousness over in these sorts of studies? Well, the first one is what's known sometimes as Darwin's test, is a test of self-recognition. And Darwin talks about this in The Descent of Man and in his treatise on the evolution of emotions, but it's not a formal laboratory test. But Darwin once was in the London Zoo observing a bunch of orangutans who had a mirror placed in their cage, and he observed that these animals responded to this mirror in one of 3 ways, kind of a sequence of ways. First, they were very alarmed by this strange object that was in their enclosure. Then they became very curious about it. Then they would approach the mirror and kiss the image in the mirror and kind of grimace at the mirror as if they were threatening some other orangutan. And then, after a while, they just ignored it. They didn't pay any attention to the mirror after all. And Darwin raised the question of what was really going through the minds of these animals. Were they reacting to the image, to their own images in the mirror, as if that image were another ape, somebody who maybe had to be acknowledged or fought off or whatever, or did they recognize themselves in the mirror and use it to kind of inspect themselves? Darwin didn't have an answer for this, but Gordon Gallup, a psychologist at the State University of New York at Albany, a century later actually came up with an answer in a series of experiments that are now deservedly recognized as classics in psychology. Gallup basically repeated Darwin's test. He had access to a bunch of chimpanzees, and what he did was to put mirrors in their enclosures and just watch, in his first study, just watch their behavior. And what he observed is pretty much what Darwin had observed, which was initially the animals explored the mirror. They'd look at it, look around it, and all that, just as if it were a new object in their environment. And then they would react to their images in the mirror as if the image represented another animal. They'd grimace at it or whatever. But later, Gallup observed that these animals would use the mirror to explore parts of their own body that they themselves couldn't see. Animal can't look at its back or its hindquarters very, very easily without a mirror, but these animals were using the mirror to do those kinds of inspections. It became very clear that these animals recognized that it was their image in the mirror, that they were looking at themselves. Here's the data from that first experiment, and we're looking at is how they respond to the image. And in the blue, are they responding to the image in the mirror, or are they responding really to themselves by inspecting themselves, for example? And what you can see is that over days, responses to the mirror drop off very, very quickly, whereas the behaviors that are self-directed increase. And Gallup argued that somewhere here around 3, 4, 5 days of exposure, the animals realized that what they saw in the mirror was really themselves. They were connecting the mirror image up to a representation of themselves. Famously, to test this idea, Gallup anesthetized these. After the animals had been exposed to a mirror for a long time, he anesthetized the chimpanzees and placed a mark on their forehead that hadn't been there before, odorless, and you couldn't really, once it had dried, you couldn't really tell it was there unless you saw it in the mirror. And what he then did is allow the animals to recover from the anesthesia in a cage with a mirror present, and look at how they reacted to it. There's also a control group that got no prior experience with the mirror, but got the anesthesia and the paint. And here are the results of this. We're looking the pre-test and post-test. Okay, this is before and after the paint was applied, and then this is the behavior of the control group. The control group's not exposed to a mirror at all, so there's really nothing for them to do. But what you can see here is that before the anesthesia and the mark, they spent an awful lot of time looking at the image in the mirror. But after the anesthesia and the mark, they spent a great deal of time looking at themselves, and especially a lot of time looking at the mark which had been applied to their forehead. Gallup concluded from this that these animals had self-awareness. They had self-consciousness. By virtue of their prolonged exposure to the mirror, they had learned what they looked like. They carried around in their heads a kind of mental image of what they themselves looked like. And then when they saw themselves in the mirror and they saw that there was this new thing on their forehead, they were quite interested in that. This is what's known as self-recognition or self-consciousness. And